The moment Alexei Morozov pointed at her, the room laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the kind of laugh that rolls through a crowd when someone with power does something unexpected, and everyone around them decides, in the space of a breath, that it must be funny. 300 people in the grand hall of the Soccer Palais in Vienna decided, in that single collective exhale, that the woman in the third row was part of the evening's entertainment. She had not agreed to that. No one had asked. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was 51 years old. She was wearing a dark blue dress that was slightly too formal for the occasion, and slightly too plain for the room. Her hair was pulled back the way people pull their hair back when they are running a few minutes late, and do not want to arrive looking like it. She was holding a glass of water with both hands, the way people do when they are not entirely sure what else to do with them. She had arrived at the charity concert that evening, as the guest of her colleague Patricia Lane, who worked at the Spanish consulate in Vienna, and had been given 2 tickets she did not want to waste. Elena had not especially wanted to come. She had come anyway, because Patricia had asked twice, and Elena had always found it difficult to say no to people who asked twice. The venue that evening was the kind of place that made people walk in and lower their voices without being asked. The Soccer Palais had been built in the late 19th century, and everything about its grand hall communicated that fact quietly and without apology. The ceiling was high and elaborately decorated. The chandeliers were old and heavy, and threw warm light in a way that modern lighting could not replicate. The seats were covered in a deep red fabric that had been repaired in places and was more beautiful for it. The acoustics were the kind that live musicians spend their careers chasing, and only a few historic buildings actually possess. The concert was a fundraiser for a children's music education foundation. It was the kind of event where the champagne was exceptional, and the cause was genuine, and most of the people in the room cared about both in roughly equal measure. The tickets had cost more than Elena earned in a week. She had known this when she sat down and had quietly decided not to think about it again. She was not a person who dwelled on the distances between things. She had been seated 3 rows from the front, which was closer than she would have chosen. Patricia had smiled apologetically when they found their seats and whispered that a colleague had given her the tickets last minute, and she had not wanted to seem ungrateful by asking about the location. Elena had said it was perfectly fine, which it was. She could see the stage clearly. She could see the piano. The piano was a Steinway Model D concert grand, 9 feet of it. Elena had looked at it for a moment when she sat down, the way you look at something you know very well but have not seen in a long time. Then she had looked away and opened the program, and read through it carefully, and folded it in her lap. Alexei Morozov needed no introduction in that room, though one was given anyway, because that is what programs and event hosts do. He was 64 years old, Russian-born, Vienna-based for the last 20 years, and the kind of famous that meant his name appeared in newspapers even when he had done nothing particularly noteworthy. He had won the Tchaikovsky competition in his 20s. He had won the Leeds International Piano Competition the same year, which was either a remarkable coincidence or a sign of something beyond ordinary talent, depending on whom you asked. He had recorded 41 albums, performed at Carnegie Hall so many times that the hall had a specific lighting configuration they called the Morozov setting, and had been the subject of 2 documentary films and 1 unauthorized biography that he had publicly called inaccurate and privately, according to people who knew him, had read twice. He was known for 2 things above everything else. The first was the precision of his playing, a quality that critics had been writing about for 4 decades and had not yet fully captured in language. The second was his wit, which was sharp and intelligent and sometimes crossed a line that people in his immediate circle had learned, over many years, not to stand too close to. He had been performing for 90 minutes when he decided to take a break between pieces. He walked to the front of the stage with the ease of a man who has walked to the front of stages for 40 years and has long since stopped noticing the act of doing it. He spoke to the audience in German first, then in English, a brief digression about the piece he had just finished that drew a few knowledgeable smiles from the front rows. He was comfortable. He was in total command. He looked at 300 people looking at him and found the experience, as he usually did, satisfying in a simple and uncomplicated way. Then his eyes moved across the audience, not searching for anyone in particular, just looking, the way performers look at crowds, reading the room, taking the temperature. He had been doing this for so long that it was less a conscious act than a reflex, a constant low-level scanning that told him things about a room that he could not always articulate but always used. His gaze stopped on Elena. She was not doing anything remarkable. She was sitting with her back straight, her glass of water in her lap, and her eyes on the stage. That was more than could be said for several people in her row, some of whom were checking their phones at seat level in a way they clearly believed was invisible and was not. Morozov had said later, in an interview that would be quoted widely, that he chose her because she looked genuinely present in a room full of people performing the appearance of presence, and that the contrast amused him. What he had meant by that, at the time, was something less generous. She looked like she could be surprised, and surprise is entertaining, and he was in a playful mood and had 300 people waiting to laugh at whatever he said next. He said, in English, projecting to the room with the relaxed confidence of someone who has never once worried about being heard. You, the woman with the water glass, would you like to play something for us? The audience laughed. It was a good laugh, warm and inclusive. Patricia leaned toward Elena and made a soft, sympathetic sound. Morozov spread his arms wide in an exaggerated gesture of welcome, which drew a second wave of laughter and a few appreciative murmurs. He was enjoying himself. He looked across the audience with the pleasant expression of a man who has just told a joke that is about to arrive at its punchline. Elena set her glass down on the empty seat beside her. She stood up. The laughter did not stop immediately. It continued for a moment, rolling through the back of the room, and then it began to change, not to stop exactly, but to alter in its quality. The people who had already seen Elena stand were processing what they were seeing. The people who had not yet seen were still laughing at the idea. These two groups coexisted for a few strange seconds in which the room was both laughing and not laughing, both inside the joke and beginning to wonder if the joke was what they had thought it was. Patricia reached for Elena's arm. Elena had already moved past her into the aisle. A few people assumed she would walk to the stage and say something funny and deflect gracefully, and that this would become a charming audience participation moment that people would mention on the way home. A few people assumed she would be nervous and play a few notes badly, and that everyone would applaud her warmly, and the evening would resume its original shape. A man named Oliver Grant, a music journalist who had been given a press seat near the sound desk at the back, watched Elena walk toward the stage with a feeling he could not immediately identify and would spend several weeks trying to name. He wrote in his notebook, before she reached the steps, "Something is wrong with this picture." He did not mean it in a negative sense. He meant it in the sense of a puzzle whose pieces have suddenly moved into an arrangement that does not match the image on the box. Elena walked up the steps to the stage. She did not hurry. She did not look at the audience. She did not look at Morozov, who had stepped to the side with a practiced theatrical bow that drew another appreciative sound from the crowd. She walked directly to the piano and sat down. She adjusted the bench. One small movement, a quarter-inch forward, entirely automatic. The body's memory of a configuration it had found thousands of times before, arriving at the exactly right distance from the keys, not too close, not too far, the position where the arms fall naturally, and the wrists align, and the weight of the upper body can move through the shoulders and into the hands without any obstruction. Morozov saw that adjustment and said something later about that moment specifically. He said that was when he knew, in the part of him that knew things before they were confirmed, before she had played a single note, before she had done anything but adjust the bench. The room was still half laughing. A few people in the front rows had gone quiet, watching. The back of the room was still carrying the original energy of the joke, the expectation of a punchline. Elena placed her hands on the keys. She did not begin immediately. She sat with her hands resting there for the space of 1 full second. And in that 1 second, something changed in the hall. It is the kind of thing that is very difficult to explain without sounding as if you are overstating it. But the people who were present would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right words for it, and would mostly not succeed. The journalist Oliver Grant wrote that it was the way she sat, that there was something in the placement of her hands and the stillness of her spine that rearranged the quality of attention in the room before she had done anything at all. A woman named Caroline Webb, who had come with her husband and would film 22 seconds of what followed, said afterward that she felt the hairs on her arms stand up, and that she had noticed the feeling before she heard the first note, before there was anything to hear. Then Elena began to play. She played the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor. Not a fragment, not an excerpt selected to show off, not a simplified arrangement. The real piece, at full depth, from the very beginning, with all its weight and architecture intact. The laughter in the back of the hall did not taper. It stopped, not gradually, not politely, but in the way a sound stops when the source of it simply ceases. One moment there was laughing and then there was not, and the not laughing had a texture to it that was different from ordinary quiet, the specific quality of a room in which 300 people have simultaneously decided, without consulting one another, to hold still. Morozov stood in the wing of the stage. He had planned to stand there for perhaps 30 seconds, a minute at most, giving the audience moment to appreciate the joke and the guest, and then reclaiming the stage with good grace and a generous comment. He was practiced at that kind of thing. He had done it many times. He did not move for 11 minutes. A man named George Hartley sat in the fourth row. He was 60 years old, a former professional cellist whose performing career had ended 14 years earlier, when damage to his left hand made certain movements impossible. He now ran a music education charity, which was why he had been invited to the concert, and he attended live performances when he could, because the ache of not being able to perform had not diminished with time, and feeding it was better than denying it. He gripped both armrests of his seat when Elena began to play, and did not release them. He said afterward that the technical quality of what he heard in the first 2 minutes was exceptional by any professional standard. He said that what he heard beneath the technical quality, in the following 9 minutes, was something he did not have a clean word for. He used the word inhabited, and then was quiet for a moment, and then said that even that was not quite right. Elena played for 11 minutes. She stopped at a natural interior resting point within the concerto, not at the end of the movement, but at a place where the music itself pauses to gather itself before continuing. She lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. The hall held 312 people that evening. For 3 full seconds, none of them made a sound. Then the applause began. It did not build slowly. It rose fast and it was loud, and it was not the warm, polite applause that follows a charming audience moment at a charity concert. It was the unguarded, unperformed response of people who have heard something that has reached past whatever they had prepared for the evening, and found something real inside them. People stood, not because the event called for a standing ovation, but because some of them were on their feet before they had made a conscious decision to stand. And once several people stood, the rest followed, not out of obligation but because remaining seated did not feel proportionate to what had happened. Patricia was crying. She would describe this afterward as embarrassing, and would also say she could not have prevented it. Elena stood from the bench. She turned to face the room. She did not smile, exactly. She nodded once, with a gravity that was not pride and was not false modesty, but something quieter than both. The acknowledgement of something that had occurred, without claiming ownership of it. Then she walked back down the steps and returned to her seat, and picked up her glass of water. Morozov had still not moved from the wing. His manager, Ingrid Bauer, a composed and experienced woman, who had worked beside him for 19 years, and was not easily unsettled, stood 3 feet behind him, and did not speak. She had seen him perform in hundreds of concerts. She had watched him move audiences to tears and to standing ovations, and to the particular reverent silence that follows extraordinary playing. She had never seen him stand completely still in the wing of his own stage, motionless, for 11 minutes, watching someone else. She waited. After a long moment, he turned to look at her. His expression was not one she had seen on him before. She would describe it later, when asked by the journalist Oliver Grant, as the expression of a man who has just been shown a room in a house he thought he knew completely, and is still standing in the doorway of it. The concert resumed 22 minutes late. Morozov walked back to the stage and played the remaining pieces on the program with the precision and control and authority that had made him one of the most respected musicians in the world. The audience responded to him warmly and generously. He was, as he always was, masterful. But the room had already found its center, and the center had been a woman in a dark blue dress who had set down her water glass and walked to a piano she had not been invited to play. Oliver Grant sat in his press seat after the final bow and wrote one line in his notebook. He would use it to open the piece he published 3 days later. It would be shared over 400,000 times. It would be translated into 14 languages. It would appear in the syllabuses of 3 university courses on the sociology of art and expertise and recognition. He wrote, "She played 11 minutes. He had planned to play 2 hours. The 11 minutes won." The backstage corridor of the Soccer Palais was warm and amber lit and crowded in the particular way that backstage areas are after a successful concert, people moving in multiple directions, carrying instrument cases and water bottles and programs, speaking loudly over one another in German and English, and at least one other language Elena could not immediately identify. The flowers sent to the artists were stacked along one wall. Someone had left a cello case in the middle of the floor, and 3 people had nearly walked into it. Elena was not trying to be found. She had collected her coat from the side room and was moving toward the exit, with the particular efficiency of someone who finds large social gatherings tiring, and has learned, over many years, to leave before the crowd thickens past the point of comfortable navigation. Patricia had been stopped near the refreshment table by a colleague from the consulate named Franz, who had spotted her across the room, and was the kind of person who considered eye contact across a room a binding social commitment. Elena had pointed toward the door and mouthed that she would wait there. She did not make it to the door. Morozov came around the corner at the end of the corridor. Ingrid Bauer was 3 steps behind him, carrying his jacket, maintaining the expression of patient efficiency that was her professional default. He was still in his performance shirt, white, slightly rumpled at the collar now, the formal precision of the stage loosened by the hour and the warmth of the building. He was moving with purpose, which meant he knew where he was going, which meant Ingrid had told him where Elena was, which Ingrid confirmed when asked about it later, and did not seem to feel any particular need to apologize for. He saw Elena. She saw him. She slowed, without stopping. He crossed the distance between them, with the directness of someone who has moved through rooms as though they belonged to him, for so many decades that the habit has become indistinguishable from character. He stopped in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the corridor continued its busy life, people moving and talking, and someone laughing very loudly about something near the instrument storage room. Morozov said, in English, "Where did you study?" It was not an apology. It was not a compliment. It was a technical question, the trained instinct of a professional who has encountered something he cannot categorize, and goes searching for the category first, because the category is where the understanding begins. Elena said, "Moscow." "The conservatory." Morozov said, "Under whom?" Elena said a name. The name was that of a teacher who had been, late in her career, the student of a woman who had studied under one of the defining figures of the early 20th century Russian piano tradition. It was a lineage of transmission, teacher to student, stretching back to an era of piano playing that most contemporary musicians knew only through recordings and historical accounts. In that lineage, certain things had been passed down that were not written in any syllabus and could not be learned from any recording. Ways of approaching a phrase, a silence, the interior of a note, ways of listening to the piano itself, as if it were a living thing with its own intentions. Morozov knew exactly what the name meant. He was quiet for a moment. Ingrid Bauer, who had worked in and around concert music for 30 years and had developed a precise understanding of when to remain present and when to make herself less so, took one quiet step back and found something interesting on the wall to her left. Morozov said, "Why did you stop?" He asked it the way someone asks a question they have been forming since before they reached you, the question that was already fully shaped before the conversation began. Elena held her coat over one arm. She looked at him steadily. She had the quality that very few people possess of being entirely comfortable with a silence she has not yet decided to fill. Then she said, "Some music is too heavy to carry in public. I needed time to grow strong enough to set it down." Morozov did not respond immediately. A group of 4 people walked past them, speaking loudly in German about dinner reservations. Neither Elena nor Morozov gave them any attention. He said, "How long?" She said, 20 years. The quality of the silence that followed was different from the silence before it. Ingrid Bauer, who had been studying the wall, felt the difference without turning around. He said, 20 years is a long time." She said, "Yes." A long pause. He was looking at her with the particular attention of someone who is trying to understand something they cannot quite reach. He said, "Do you teach?" She said, "Secondary school, music theory, some instrument." He said, "Not performance." She said, "Not performance." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I would like you to perform with me. There is a concert in Prague in April. I want to put you on the program." Elena looked at him for a moment. She showed no surprise, which Ingrid noticed and would mention later, because in 19 years she had not once seen anyone receive an offer from Morozov without showing surprise. Even people who had been expecting an offer showed surprise when it arrived, because the directness of his manner carried a weight that the preparation for it did not fully account for. Elena said, "No, but thank you." Morozov blinked. The word "no," in the specific context of professional offers, had not reached him with any regularity in several decades. He said, "You understand what I am offering?" Elena said, "Yes." He said, "Then explain to me why." This was not his most elegant moment, and he would have acknowledged that if asked, but he was genuinely confused, and genuine confusion, for a man of his particular confidence and experience, expressed itself as directness, because the only tools he had fully trusted for 40 years were directness and precision, and they had not failed him yet. Elena said, "If I accept an offer, I become someone who has accepted an offer. The music changes when that happens. I know this about myself." He said, "You played for 300 people tonight." She said, "Yes, and it was still clean." He said, "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. In the corridor around them, the crowd was thinning. The instrument storage room had gone quiet. Someone had turned off one of the overhead lights at the far end, and the amber warmth had concentrated itself around the section of corridor where they stood, which gave the whole conversation, in memory, the quality of something that happened in a separate and self-contained space from the rest of the evening. She said, "I did not come here to play. I did not prepare for it. I did not need anything from the room before I began. I simply sat down. That is the only way I can do it now." He said, "You could learn to do it differently again." She looked at him, not unkindly. She said, "I know. That is not what I want." Oliver Grant was at the far end of the corridor. He had been given backstage access by Ingrid, who had included him in the press arrangements for the evening, and he had followed the flow of people back here without a specific intention, with the journalist's general habit of being in the place where things were still happening. He could see Morozov and Elena from his position, but could not hear them. He watched their body language with the attentiveness of someone who knows they are watching something that will matter later and does not want to miss any of it, even the parts they cannot interpret. He saw Elena say something. He saw Morozov's expression change. He saw her make a small movement that might have been a nod, and then he saw her excuse herself, politely, and continue down the corridor toward the exit. Morozov watched her go. He stood there for a moment, not moving, in the amber light of the corridor, with Ingrid behind him and the rest of the evening continuing its business around him. Then he said, quietly, and not to anyone in particular, "Of course." Ingrid did not ask what he meant. She had worked with him for 19 years. She understood that some things he said were for the room, and some things he said were for himself, and this one was for himself, and she was a professional who knew the difference and respected it. George Hartley, the former cellist, had also made his way backstage through the general post-concert movement of guests and artists. He was standing near the refreshment table at the corridor's far end, close enough to observe but not close enough to hear. He watched Morozov stand still in the corridor for a moment after Elena had walked away, and he said afterward that Morozov's expression reminded him of the expression he had seen on the faces of very experienced musicians when they hear something that makes them go back and reconsider something they had believed to be settled. He said, "It is a look of productive discomfort. The best teachers learn to value that expression. It means the education is happening." The concert had ended. The hall was clearing. Patricia had found Elena at the door, and they had walked out together into the cool Vienna night. Patricia still composing herself, Elena with her coat buttoned and her bag over her shoulder, moving at the same pace she had maintained all evening. Patricia said, "Are you all right?" Elena said, "Yes." Patricia said, "What were you two talking about, you and Morozov?" Elena said. He offered me a concert. Patricia stopped walking for a moment. Then she caught up. She said, "And?" Elena said, "I said no." Patricia was quiet for a block and a half. Then she said, "Okay." Elena said, "Yes." They walked the rest of the way to the hotel in the particular companionable silence of two people who have known each other long enough to understand that some explanations are not necessary, and some decisions do not require commentary. The city was quiet at that hour. The old streets of the First District absorbed the sound of their footsteps without returning it. The lights along the Ringstrasse were reflected in the wet pavement from rain that had fallen while they were inside, and the reflections wavered and separated and reformed with each small disturbance of the air. Elena looked at the city around her as she walked. She had been to Vienna 3 times before in her life. The first time she was 23 years old and had come to compete in a piano competition she had not won, placing third, which at the time had felt like failure and which she now understood had been exactly the right result for a 23-year-old who had not yet figured out the difference between playing well and playing truly. The second time she was 28 and had come with a man named Daniel, who was a composer and who she had been with for 4 years, and whose name she now thought of only rarely and without any particular emotion. The third time she was 31 and had come for a master class with a teacher whose name she did not share with people because the sharing always led to questions she did not want to answer. This was the fourth time. She was 51. She had just played Rachmaninoff in the Soccer Palais for 300 people, including one of the most celebrated pianists alive, at the invitation of a joke. She walked through the quiet streets of Vienna and felt, more than anything else, clear. Not happy, exactly, though she was not unhappy. Not proud, though she did not feel ashamed. Clear in the way that you feel after doing something you have been preparing for, without knowing you were preparing for it, the completion of something that had no formal beginning, and therefore arrived as a surprise even to the person it was happening to. The 3 videos went online before midnight. Daniel Cooper, 22, architecture student, who had been given his ticket by a professor and had nearly skipped the concert because of an assignment deadline, posted his first. The footage was shaky for the first few seconds, then steadied. It captured 4 minutes of Elena's playing from the 8th row with the compromised audio of a phone microphone in a reverberant hall, which meant it was inadequate and it was enough. He posted it with a caption that said, "A famous pianist asked a random woman in the audience to play as a joke. This is what happened." He went to bed. By 3 in the morning, 900,000 people had watched it. Caroline Webb, a doctor from Bristol who had come to Vienna with her husband for a long weekend and had been given the concert tickets by the hotel concierge who could not use them, posted her video from the 3rd row. She had not planned to post it. She had filmed it because her daughter, who was 15, and who played piano with the particular ferocity of teenagers who love something too much to pretend otherwise, needed to see it. She sent it to her daughter. Her daughter posted it without asking permission, which she would apologize for later, and which Caroline would ultimately decide she did not mind. By morning, the video had 4 million views. By the following afternoon, it had been shared on every significant classical music platform in the world, and on most of the ones that had nothing to do with classical music. The 3rd video had been taken by someone backstage. No one would confirm who. It was 43 seconds long, and it showed only Morozov in the wing of the stage, standing perfectly still, watching. His face was in partial shadow from the stage lighting, but the quality of his stillness was entirely visible. The absolute arrested attention of a man who has encountered something he cannot resolve with the tools he has spent 40 years perfecting. It was the 3rd video that people shared most often. Not the playing, but the listener. The man who had made the joke, standing in the place the joke had been made, unable to move. Oliver Grant had not slept by 3 in the morning. He was at the desk in his hotel room with his notebook and his laptop and a strong institutional coffee from a machine in the corridor, and he was not yet writing, he was thinking, which for him was an active and almost physical process that involved moving around the room and occasionally saying things aloud to no one, and writing words down, and then crossing them out and writing other words. He had been a music journalist for 22 years. He had covered competitions and premieres and retrospectives and controversies, and the deaths of important musicians and the emergence of new ones. He had sat in hundreds of concert halls on several continents and listened to some of the finest musicians of his generation and written about what he heard with what he believed was care and honesty and a genuine attempt at accuracy. He was aware, sitting in that hotel room at 3 in the morning, that what he had witnessed that evening was different in kind from anything he had covered before. Not in the playing itself, though the playing was extraordinary, in something else, in the relationship between the playing and everything surrounding it, in the specific meaning produced by the fact that a woman with no public presence, no recorded output, no professional platform, had sat down at one of the most famous pianos in the world and played one of the most demanding concertos in the repertoire, and then stood up and gone back to her seat and picked up her water glass. He wrote a title and crossed it out. He wrote another and let it stay. He began to write the piece that would become one of the most widely shared pieces of music criticism in the history of online journalism, which was a description he would find slightly mortifying when people applied it, and which he would also acknowledge was not inaccurate. He wrote through the night and into the early morning, and published just before 8, and then went to bed and slept for 4 hours, and woke to find his phone entirely unresponsive from the number of notifications it was trying to process. Elena woke at 7 in her hotel room, which was small and clean and had a view of a courtyard with a linden tree. She made tea with the electric kettle on the desk. She sat at the small table by the window and drank it, and looked at the tree and thought about the train schedule back to Madrid. Her phone, which she did not check first thing in the morning as a matter of habit, was in her bag on the other side of the room. It would stay there for another hour. She was not thinking about the previous evening in any analytical way. She was not reviewing it or evaluating it or considering its implications. She was simply sitting with it, the way you sit with something large and quiet after it has happened, letting it be what it was without needing to name it yet. The linden tree in the courtyard had last year's leaves still attached to a few of its branches, the ones that had not fallen in autumn, and had stayed through winter, dry and brown and holding on with no particular purpose, except that nothing had dislodged them yet. She looked at them for a while. The morning light was thin and clear, the specific quality of early spring light in Central Europe, which is not warm exactly but is not cold either, and which contains in it something that feels, even to people who do not know the word for it, like promise. She finished her tea. She showered and dressed and went to find Patricia, who had texted her twice asking if she wanted to have breakfast together before the train. She did. They sat at a corner table in the hotel breakfast room. Patricia ordered eggs and coffee. Elena ordered bread and more tea. Patricia had slept well despite the crying and was in the energized and slightly wonderstruck state that follows an evening of genuine surprise. She said, over her coffee, "Are you aware that you have 43 missed calls?" Elena said, "No." Patricia said, "I checked your phone while you were in the bathroom." Elena said, "Patricia." Patricia said, "3 videos of you have been shared about 1,000,000 times each." Elena was quiet for a moment. She put butter on her bread. Then she said, "Oh." Patricia said, "That's all you're going to say?" Elena said, "I don't know what else to say." Patricia said, "How about, I should respond to some of these calls?" Elena said, "I don't think I should." Patricia looked at her across the table for a long moment. She had known Elena for 11 years. She was one of the few people who had ever heard Elena play, in informal settings at her apartment, and she had always understood, in a general way, that Elena's talent was significantly beyond what her professional life expressed. She had not understood, until the previous evening, by how much. The gap between what Elena was and what Elena had permitted the world to see was, it turned out, enormous. This was not a comfortable thing to know about a person you cared about, and Patricia was still processing it. She said, "Don't you think people deserve to hear you play?" Elena considered this carefully. She was that kind of person, someone who considered things carefully before answering, which some people found frustrating and others found deeply reassuring. She said, "I think people deserve a lot of things. I don't think I am obligated to provide all of them." Patricia was quiet. Elena said, more gently, "I played last night, genuinely played, not a performance, not a demonstration, just the music. I was able to do that because nothing was at stake, because I had not prepared for it, and no one had expectations of me, and I owed no one anything. If I begin accepting offers and giving interviews, and building a public presence, all of those things disappear, and the playing changes. I know this. I have known it since I was 31 years old. Patricia said, "What happened when you were 31? Elena smiled, briefly. I stopped. There are moments in the trajectory of a story that are not dramatic, but are structurally essential. The moments that establish the logic by which everything else will be understood. Elena's return to Madrid was one of them. She arrived on a Monday evening, took the metro from the station, let herself into her apartment, and the apartment was exactly as she had left it. The plants on the windowsill needed water. There was a letter from her building's residents' association about the shared hallway. The upright piano against the wall had a thin layer of dust on the lid that she wiped off with a cloth before she opened it. She did not play that night. She was tired from traveling, and she ate something simple and went to bed. She went to work the next morning. The school was a secondary institution in the Chamber district of Madrid, where Elena had taught for 9 years. She taught music theory to students between 13 and 16 and gave instrument instruction to 32 students across various levels. She arrived at her usual time, 7:45, made tea in the staff room, from the good tea she kept in her own cabinet, because the school-provided tea was, in her considered opinion, not really tea. She put her bag down at her desk. She arranged her materials for the first class. A colleague named Laura Simmons arrived. Laura was 28, had been at the school for 2 years, and taught music in the room beside Elena's. She was talented and enthusiastic, and sometimes slightly too eager to talk first thing in the morning, which Elena had found, over 2 years, to be one of her endearing qualities, as long as Elena had finished her tea first. Laura said, "Have you seen the videos?" Elena said, "I am aware of them." Laura said, "You have 80 million views." Elena looked at her over the rim of her mug. Laura said, "Combined, across all 3 videos, by this morning." Elena said, "That seems like a lot." Laura said, "Elena, Morozov called you corrective in an interview." Elena said, "I heard." Laura said, "In an interview that has been shared 600,000 times." Elena said, "Laura." Laura said, "Yes?" Elena said, "I have a class in 8 minutes." Laura said, "Right. Yes, of course." She paused. "Are you all right?" Elena said, "I am perfectly all right. I played a piano. People watched it. Now I am going to teach music theory to 14-year-olds, which is what I do." She picked up her materials and walked to her classroom. The students knew. Of course they knew. They were teenagers in the age of shared video, and 3 of them asked her about it directly before she had finished writing the day's objectives on the board. She answered each question briefly and without deflection. Yes, that was her. Yes, it had been unexpected. Yes, the piano had been exceptional. And now, please, open your notebooks. The lessons proceeded. Elena moved through the school day with the same attention and patience she brought to every school day, which was the attention and patience of someone who believes that teaching 14-year-olds to understand the structure of music is genuinely important work. Not because it will necessarily produce great musicians, but because it produces people who can hear, and hearing changes everything. The offers were arriving. Patricia had set up a temporary email arrangement to receive and hold them, because the school's administrative office had already received 3 formal letters and 1 personal visit from someone claiming to represent a recording label, and the school's principal, a kind and organized man named Rafael Ortega, had come to Elena's classroom during lunch to let her know and to ask, carefully, how she wanted to handle it. Elena said, "Tell them I am a teacher. That is not going to change." Rafael nodded. He was not a man who required explanation, which was one of the reasons Elena had been content at this school for 9 years. He said, "There is also someone from a newspaper in the waiting area." Elena said, "You can tell them I am unavailable." He said, "They have been there for 3 hours." She said, "They can continue to be unavailable." He went back to his office. The person from the newspaper waited another 2 hours and then left. A different person from a different newspaper came the next day, and the day after that. Elena arrived at school and taught and went home. She answered none of the calls or letters. She gave no interview. She made no public statement. What she did instead was what she had done the evening before, and the evening before that, and every evening for 20 years. She went home, and eventually she sat down at the piano, and she played. The journalist Oliver Grant had been trying, through various indirect channels, to find a way to speak with Elena for 3 weeks. He had contacted Patricia, who had said kindly but firmly that Elena was not available for interviews. He had gone through the school's administrative office, which had referred him to Elena, who had not responded. He had sent a letter to her apartment address, obtained through public records, which had been neither acknowledged nor returned. He was not offended. He understood. He had written a piece that helped make her one of the most discussed figures in classical music, and she had not asked for the piece to be written, and she owed him nothing, and he knew this and accepted it. He decided to write a follow-up piece without an interview, which was not ideal from a journalistic standpoint, but which he had the material to do because of everything else that was happening in the story's aftermath. He spent a week making calls. He spoke to George Hartley. He spoke to Caroline Webb. He spoke to Daniel Cooper, who had recently changed his field of study from architecture to acoustic engineering, and who said, when asked if that decision was related to the concert in Vienna, a short pause and then, "Not in a way I can fully explain, but yes." He spoke to Ingrid Bauer, who was careful and professional, and confirmed several facts without adding anything she considered private. He attempted to speak to Morozov directly, and received, through Morozov's office, a brief written statement. The statement said, "I have been asked many times to describe what I heard on the evening of March the 14th. I am not able to improve on what I said in the interview published last Tuesday. The word I used was corrective. I used it because it was the most accurate word I had. She played in a way that corrects things. I am still being corrected. I expect this will continue for some time." Grant used the statement in the piece. He also used something Ingrid Bauer had said, carefully, during their conversation. She had said, "He has changed the way he plays. Not dramatically, but people who know him well, and have listened to him for many years, notice it. He sits inside certain notes differently now. He is not in a hurry to leave them. That is something she gave him. He would not put it in those terms because that is not the way he uses language, but that is what happened." Grant wrote his follow-up piece and published it 6 weeks after the concert. By then, the initial wave of attention had begun to settle, which meant the piece was read by the people who were genuinely interested, rather than the people who were interested because everyone else was, and was perhaps more useful for that. He wrote about the specific qualities that musicians and critics had identified in Elena's playing. He wrote about the lineage of teaching she had come from, and what that lineage represented in the history of the tradition. He wrote about the difference between technical excellence and what George Hartley had called inhabited playing, and about how rare the second thing is, and how often it is confused with the first. He wrote about Morozov, not unkindly, as someone who had been carrying the first thing to a very high level for a very long time, and had, in 11 minutes, been shown a glimpse of the second. He ended the piece differently from how he had ended the first one. He ended it with a question that he did not answer. He wrote, "Elena Vasquez went home. She has not given a concert, not granted an interview, not responded to any of the offers or the attention. She is teaching 14-year-olds to read music in a school in Madrid. And the videos keep being watched, and Morozov keeps playing with that altered quality in certain passages, and Daniel Cooper is studying acoustics, and Laura Simmons is practicing again after a 5-year break, and Caroline Webb's daughter, who is 16 and ferociously talented, has started practicing 3 hours a day instead of 1. Elena Vasquez played 11 minutes and then went home. What exactly did she give the world when she did that? And is there something important in the fact that she did not stay to watch the world receive it?" He did not answer the question. He was not sure it had an answer, or at least not a simple one, and he had learned in 22 years of writing that the questions worth asking are rarely the ones with simple answers. The piece was shared 250,000 times. It was shorter than the first piece, and less immediately striking, but the people who read it carefully and thought about it for more than a moment tended to find it more lasting. In Madrid, on a Thursday evening in late spring, Elena sat at her upright piano with the window open. The street outside was carrying the particular sounds of a Madrid evening: a bicycle on cobblestones, 2 people arguing pleasantly about something, a child calling out from a window above. She had been home for an hour. She had eaten, changed out of her work clothes, made tea that was now cooling on the table beside the piano. She had checked the mail, which contained nothing interesting. She had watered the plants. She opened the piano lid. She placed her hands on the keys and sat for a moment in the particular quality of waiting that precedes playing, the silence just before the first sound, which has its own texture and is part of the music even before the music begins. Then she played. She played for herself, which was what she had been doing for 20 years. Not for the idea of an audience, not for the memory of one, not with any part of herself listening as if from the outside. Just the music, moving through her hands, filling the room, going out through the open window into the evening street below where it became part of the sounds of the city. Someone's piano playing drifting down from a second-floor window, which is one of the ordinary beautiful things about cities that people who live in them stop noticing. The students walking past on the pavement below could hear it. A woman walking her dog paused for a moment at the sound and looked up at the window and then walked on. A boy on a skateboard rolled by and did not hear it because he had headphones in. A couple stopped for 10 seconds, listening, and then continued their conversation and walked on. None of them knew whose hands were making the sound. The sound did not need them to know. It went on being itself regardless. Elena played for an hour and 15 minutes. She stopped at a natural place, not because she was tired, but because the music arrived at a point of rest, and she allowed it to rest. She lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. The street sounds came back into focus. The child in the window above had stopped calling. The couple had walked on. Somewhere farther away, someone was playing a radio. She sat for a moment in the quiet after. Then she closed the piano lid, gently, the way you close something you will open again. She picked up her tea. It was cold. She went to the kitchen and made new tea and stood at the counter while the kettle boiled and looked out the small window at the interior courtyard of the building, which had a small orange tree that she had been watching for 3 years, and that produced, every spring, about 7 oranges, which was not very many oranges but was enough for the courtyard to smell extraordinary for 2 weeks. The oranges were coming in. The small, hard green buds of them were visible on the branches in the fading light. She made her tea and went back to the living room and sat in the chair by the bookshelf and read for an hour. Morozov performed in Prague in April, as scheduled, without her. He performed the program he had planned and played it as well as he played anything, which was exceptionally well. The reviews were strong. A reviewer named Christine Albrecht, who had been covering his performances for 12 years, wrote something in the closing paragraph of her review that editors at 3 different outlets chose to pull from the body of the text and use as a featured quotation. She wrote, "Morozov played the Brahms intermezzo in the second half, with a quality I have not heard from him before. There was a patience in certain passages, a willingness to remain inside a phrase rather than to move through it, that added to the music a dimension that technical mastery alone does not provide. I do not know where this came from, but I found myself grateful for it." Christine Albrecht had not been in Vienna. She did not know about Elena. She was describing what she heard in the music, and reaching for words to account for a change she could not explain. Ingrid Bauer read the review on the morning it was published, standing in the kitchen of her apartment with her first coffee of the day. She read the relevant paragraph twice. Then she put down the review and finished her coffee and sent Morozov a short message that said only, "Christine Albrecht noticed." His response came 4 minutes later. "I know." George Hartley, 6 months after the concert, sat down to write a piece for a music education journal. He had been asked to write about the teaching of musical expression, specifically the question of how a teacher communicates to a student the difference between playing the notes correctly and playing the music truly, which is one of the oldest and most persistent questions in music pedagogy, and one that most teachers of sufficient honesty admit they do not fully know how to answer. He wrote a piece that was 10 pages long and drew on 30 years of professional experience in teaching and thinking about these questions. In the 9th page, he wrote 1 paragraph about the concert in Vienna. He did not describe it in detail. He wrote, "I have watched thousands of musicians perform. I have heard perhaps a dozen play in a way that made me understand, in a new way, what the best playing actually is. On an evening in March of this year, I sat in the 4th row of a concert hall and heard a woman play for 11 minutes in a way that rearranged something in my understanding. She had not been invited to play. She had been asked as a joke. She sat down and played with the complete absence of needing anything from the room. And that absence is, I now believe, the precise quality that separates playing well from playing truly. You cannot manufacture it. You cannot perform it. You can only arrive at it by some combination of talent and time, and a particular kind of internal work that I am not sure any teacher can teach directly, but you can point toward it. You can help a student understand what it is that they are working toward, even if the working toward it is something they must ultimately do alone. The journal published the piece, which was read mostly by music educators and mostly in professional settings, and which was not widely shared outside those circles, but it was kept. It appeared on several recommended reading lists for music teachers in training. It was included in a syllabus at the Royal College of Music the following year. It did the quiet work that useful pieces do, moving through professional networks at walking pace, arriving where it was needed without announcement. Daniel Cooper, in his first year of acoustic engineering studies, wrote a short essay for an introductory course about the specific acoustic properties of the Soccer Palais concert hall. He had gone back to Vienna for a weekend to take measurements. He wanted to understand the physical dimensions of the experience he had filmed on his phone, what the room was doing with the sound, how the architecture was shaping what reached the audience's ears. The essay was technically competent, his professor said, and showed genuine curiosity, which in a first-year essay was the most important thing. In the conclusion, he wrote, "The acoustic properties of the room account for some of what the audience experienced. They do not account for all of it. I have been unable to determine, using the tools available to me at this stage of my education, what accounts for the remainder. I am studying partly, in the hope of finding better tools." His professor read this and wrote in the margin, "Good, keep going." Laura Simmons, in October of the year of the concert, went to an open session at a community music space near her apartment in Madrid, and played the piano for the first time in public in 5 years. It was an informal session, the kind where anyone could sit down and play for however long they wanted, with no particular expectation of quality. There were 6 other people in the room, all of them there for their own reasons. She played for 20 minutes, badly in some places and well in others, and when she finished she felt a thing she had not felt in 5 years, which was the specific uncomplicated relief of having done the thing you were afraid of, and found that the fear was not proportionate to the reality. She thought about Elena while she was playing, not constantly, but when she found herself tensing against the watching eyes in the room, she thought about what Elena had said in the staff room about getting yourself out of the way, and she tried that, and it helped, imperfectly and incompletely, which is how most helpful things help. She went back the following week. Caroline Webb's daughter, whose name was Fiona, practiced 3 hours a day through the summer and into the autumn, and passed her grade 8 piano examination in November with a distinction. She had been working toward grade 8 for 2 years, making slow progress that her teacher described as technically sufficient but emotionally cautious. After Vienna, something had changed. Her teacher said later that she had begun to play into the music rather than through it, which was a distinction that would have been difficult to explain to anyone who had not heard the difference, but which the teacher had spent a career recognizing and was very pleased to be hearing now. Fiona knew what had changed. She had watched Elena's video many times. She had watched Morozov standing in the wing. She had read Grant's pieces. She was 16, and she understood things with the particular directness of 16, before the understanding learns to negotiate with complexity. She understood this. The woman had played without needing anything from the room, and that had made the room need her. That was the whole of it. You give up the need, and then you have the thing the need was preventing. She was 16. She was not yet sure how to apply this to her own life in the broader sense, but she could apply it to the piano, and she did. In Vienna, Morozov continued to perform. He continued to be reviewed and admired and documented. He continued to hold the position in the landscape of classical music that he had held for 40 years. He also continued to be corrected. He said this himself, in a second interview given 8 months after the concert, when the journalist asked whether the experience had changed his playing, and he said yes, and was asked in what way, and he said, "I am less in a hurry. In certain passages I was always in a hurry, not consciously, but there was an urgency in me to move through the music, to demonstrate the next thing, and the next thing. She had no urgency. She was entirely inside each moment. I have been trying to find my way to that. The journalist asked, "Have you succeeded?" Morozov said, "Sometimes, for a few minutes, then I become myself again." He said it without apparent self-pity, as a straightforward account of his experience. The way someone reports the progress of a long and difficult project they are committed to, regardless of how long it takes. The journalist asked, "Have you been in contact with her?" He said, "No." The journalist asked, "Would you like to be?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think she gave me something very specific and very complete. I do not think I should go looking for more." He paused. He said, "Also, I suspect she would not be interested in being found." This last sentence was included in the published interview and drew, in the comments and responses that followed it, a variety of reactions. Some people found it poignant, some found it funny, some found it accurate to the point of being uncomfortable, the recognition of a man confronting the limits of his own significance in someone else's story. A few people found it, simply, true. Elena was at the school in Madrid. She was in the middle of a lesson with a group of 15-year-olds who were learning to identify chord progressions by ear, which is a skill that requires patience to teach, because it requires patience to acquire, and patience is not a quality that 15-year-olds possess in abundance, but that they can develop if given the right conditions and enough time. She played a chord on the piano in the corner of the classroom. She waited. A girl in the second row said, "Minor?" Elena said, "What kind of minor?" The girl listened. Then she said, "Natural minor." Elena said, "Close. Try again." She played the chord again, this time moving through the progression that followed it, letting the harmony do the work of making the relationship clear. Around the room, 15 faces were doing the work of listening, the particular concentrated attention of people who are trying to hear something they do not yet fully know how to hear. This was the work. It was not glamorous, and it was not documented, and it was not subject to viral video, and it was not being corrected or interviewed or invited to Prague. It was a woman at a piano in a school in Madrid, playing a chord and waiting for a 15-year-old to hear it properly. She played the chord again. The girl in the second row was quiet. Then she said, "Dorian?" Elena said, "Yes." She smiled. She played the next chord. In her apartment that evening, the window was open again. The orange tree in the courtyard below had finished its brief season of extraordinary scent. The oranges were there now, small and bright, 7 of them, exactly 7. Elena sat at the piano. She played for no reason except the music, for no audience except the open window and the evening, and the possibility that some of what came out might drift down into the courtyard and soften the air for a moment before it was gone. It is enough to play like that. It had always been enough. The music does not need you to know it was there. It only needs to be real while it is happening, and it was real. The notes rose and turned in the room, and went out through the window and dissolved into the Madrid evening, which received them the way evenings receive everything, without distinction and without judgment, making room. The piano key released. The last note faded. The evening continued, as evenings do. Elena closed the piano. She made tea. She sat by the bookshelf and read until the light outside changed and it was fully dark, and the street below was quieter. She set down her book. She turned off the lamp. She slept. In the soccer palais in Vienna, in the amber-lit corridor, there was no longer anyone standing. The concert had ended months ago. The hall had held other concerts, other musicians, other audiences who had arrived dressed carefully, and gone home moved or unmoved or somewhere in between. The corridor smelled of old wood and no flowers. The cello case was not in the middle of the floor. Everything was exactly as it had been before, except that it was not, quite. Something had moved through the room in March, through the hall and the corridor and the wing of the stage, and the amber-lit space where a conversation had happened in which a woman said, "Some music is too heavy to carry in public, and I needed time to grow strong enough to set it down." And she had set it down, in the middle of an evening that was supposed to be about something else. She had set it down and walked away, and it had remained there, in the room and in the people who had been in the room, in the videos and the pieces and the changed playing of a famous man, and the renewed practice of a young teacher, and the distinction achieved by a 16-year-old, and the field of study chosen by a young man who had nearly stayed home that evening to finish an assignment. The music does not disappear when it stops. It becomes part of what has happened, and what has happened does not disappear. Elena Vasquez played 11 minutes. She put it down and she walked away, and the 11 minutes kept moving, the way music moves when it is true, which is to say, without any fixed direction, and without any fixed destination, and without any particular need for the person who made it, to know where it goes, or to watch it arrive. It goes where it goes. It arrives where it arrives. And somewhere in Madrid, in a second-floor apartment with a view of an orange tree, a woman sleeps the uncomplicated sleep of someone who has given what she had to give and kept what was hers to keep, and neither the giving nor the keeping has cost her anything she was not willing to pay. That is the whole of the story. That is exactly enough.